All right, Macbeth is our subject this afternoon. I was just saying I'm not even sure why I put Macbeth ahead of the other three tragedies, because in terms of chronology it comes at the tail end, so it's the last of the four great tragedies, written after King Lear in 1605, the so-called Scottish tragedy. Adopted from Holinshed's Chronicles, like many of his plays. Macbeth was a Scottish king around the year 1000 to 1066 AD, time of Edward the Confessor in England. It's an interesting era. Historically significant figure in some ways, because the monarch has changed, and the reigning monarch, when Shakespeare performs this, is not Elizabeth anymore. It is now King James, the sixth of Scotland, the first of the United Kingdom, which is a source of grievance to Scots to this day, by the way, because English say he's James the First because it's the United Kingdom, and he's the first James in the United Kingdom. That's why he's James the First and not James the Sixth. But that, by that same argument, the current Elizabeth ought to be Elizabeth the First, and she's Elizabeth the Second. So they say, what gives? And the English say, deal with it, basically. Which doesn't go over very well. Anyway, but Macbeth, James believed that Banquo was his forebear. So when you're reading the play and you see Banquo and his actions, think about that fact. James was quite sure that he was descended from Banquo. There is an allusion in the play to a double scepter, which would unite England and Scotland under one dynasty, or dynasty as they'd say it in Britain, namely the Stuart. But that has not yet happened. But in that sense, it has that sort of quality that the Aeneid does. It's a reference to a past figure who will have a future significance. So the Stuart dynasty who will come out of Banquo. This is a very different play than King Lear is. We haven't done Lear yet, so it's a little unfortunate I have to make comparison to it, but Lear was quite a lengthy play, the most classical play in terms of its structure, at least in following Aristotle's template, if you will. Whereas Macbeth is a very short play. It's also a very dark play. Most of its scenes take place at night, and darkness is a theme of the play as well. It's not just the setting. A sense of the significance, the moral significance of darkness is ever present in the play. The play really is dealing with this theme that we've already established in the comedies, order and the subversion of order. Here, it's not only brought about, there's a subversion of the natural order, there's a subversion of the supernatural order, which is exemplified by the emergence right at the outset of the three witches. Now, that's also significant because James was quite convinced of the existence of witches and was concerned about witchcraft. And so Shakespeare doubtless knew this fact and introduces the machinery of witches into his play. We don't know what Shakespeare himself thinks of that fact, but he has already introduced supernatural figures in his other plays, but these ones have a particularly malign feature. They're not just fairies, they're witches, and as such, they're seen as demonic, and they will appeal to Hecate, a figure of the underworld in ancient pagan mythology, but often associated with Satan. So these witches are not just supernatural figures, they're malign in some ways. I'll come more to the witches in a bit. But there's a disruption of order in which King Duncan is murdered by one of his subjects, which is regicide, and obviously the subversion of the political order and the natural order is matched by the subversion of God's order, in the sense that there's a demonic subversion going on. So there's a subversion on all sorts of level. So anarchy is brought into the play right from the outset. And we will also see, and this is one of the things that so interests the Romantics about Shakespeare in general, is that there's an intense exploration of Macbeth's inner self, and not just Macbeth, but his wife, Lady Macbeth, who's almost as famous as Macbeth, if not more so. There seems to be an exploration of the inner person, the inner landscape, and there's a disintegration that takes place there. Lady Macbeth goes mad in the play. Out damn spot. She can't get the blood off her hands. There's no blood on her hands anymore, but her guilt is writ on her hands. She can't get it off. So there's the morality of it, but there's even the psychology of it, the sense of guilt and the way he plays on that. And so that very fact is of great interest to the Romantics, who are intensely interested in psychology. Now, Macbeth and Shakespeare is not the only playwright to deal with such matters. You will find that in Greek tragedies as well. There will be a sense of guilt as a motivation. But Shakespeare explores it perhaps more keenly and more intently, and with greater scope. So it is a story, it's a story of ambition and also of guilt. And there's a questioning of moral boundaries by the hero being Macbeth. It's the tragedy of Macbeth, by the way. It's interesting. It's not the tragedy of King Duncan. It's the tragedy of Macbeth. It's named after him. What's so tragic about Macbeth? The tragedy of Macbeth is that Macbeth is a good man who recognizes that there is a moral boundary that he ought not to cross. He ought not to slay the king, who's a good man, who he's sworn to by an oath. And he is a heroic individual. He's a great warrior. He recognizes the importance of faithfulness and duty. But his ambition leads him to cross the line that he clearly sees. It's a clear, bright line. He knows he ought not to do it. He does it anyway because he's ambitious. So in that sense, it's a tragedy. A man who is superior to us. And I think we need to recognize that Macbeth at the outset has to seem like a good man and a man we will admire at the outset. Otherwise, the tragedy is not quite so apparent. Whether Shakespeare is successful in presenting him in an admirable fashion, that's another matter. I think it's obvious in Oedipus, for instance, that he's an admirable man. There's all sorts of reasons why. And one of them is that he wants to get to the bottom of who the murderer is, and he's going to do it no matter what happens. He's going to find him out, and he's going to punish him, even if it's in his own house. He's going to get that guy, whoever it is, no matter what. And everyone starts, once they figure out that it's Oedipus, they say, stop right now. You have to stop. And he will not stop because he's a just man. And so we admire his character. We don't have the same opportunity with Macbeth because he willfully transgresses the boundaries of moral duty right in the first act. So his character isn't established in the same way. So does that affect our sense of the fall? I think it does. it's still an exploration of the power of temptation and of sin. And Macbeth, the figure, serves a dual function. He is the author and the instigator of the evil in the play. He is the author of it. He commits the evil act and instigates it. He doesn't just do it. He sets out to do it. And his wife, his counterpart, seems to have no compunction. This is an interesting thing about his wife. Is chiding him for having any reservations at all. You're not a man enough. And in fact, she attacks his manhood precisely because he will not do the thing that his ambition desires. She said, "You're not much of a man, are you?" And his response is, "If to do this would no longer be a man." So there's a sense of manhood that's the issue of what constitutes manhood is in question there. She's referring to his physical prowess and ambition, but almost in an animalistic way, whereas he sees it in a sense of moral virtue. If I do that, I will not be a man. A lot of play on what constitutes masculinity will find the same thing in relation to the femininity of Lady Macbeth. She calls upon herself to be unsexed, to do the duty, because she feels compassion as a woman and wants to rid herself of that natural virtue of compassion, which will prevent her from her ambition. So she does have it. She does feel it in herself, but she encourages him to ignore his own. In the end, she starts out and seems like she has no reservations, but she breaks and he does not in the end. Macbeth at the end of the play is a very dangerous man. Lady Macbeth has rendered herself an invalid. She can't function. So he is the author and instigator of the evil damage in the plot, is Macbeth. At the same time, he is the main commentator on the evil that's done in the play. And that is interesting. And that's because the worst victim of the evil wrought by Macbeth is Macbeth himself. That's the tragedy of Macbeth. He's illustrating the terrible consequences of evil for the person who commits evil, which is not what you normally hear. You normally hear in discussions about evil doing the victims of evil and how that, the unwitting victims, the poor individual who was murdered, whatever. That's not, that is there in the play, but that's not Shakespeare's main emphasis. The main emphasis is to show how it destroys Macbeth's soul. He takes the king's life, but he loses his soul. So this is a Christian play, and it's about the greater tragedy of losing one's soul in the process of gaining earthly power. Therein lies the tragedy. It's a Christian play about the loss of a man's soul. So very theological. I think without the theological understanding, this play doesn't really make sense. And a commentator that is not aware of that just really misses the point. Makes it all about psychology. It is psychology, there's no doubt about it, but there's more at work than that. It is about damnation. And that becomes clear in the light of the play. So we'll come to that when we come to that scene. But Macbeth is his own worst victim. That's the tragedy here. And in that, he is illustrating to some degree something that Plato taught, that Socrates says in his dialogues at various points, which is that the man who has no restraint on his power is the least happy of all men, because no one can stop him. And he can never be checked. And he therefore can't know the difference between good and evil, and right and wrong. He is able to do whatever he wants to do. His opponents, the sophists, say, but that is exactly what the good is, to do whatever you want to do. in the Republic, Thrasymachus says that to be just, what is justice? Well, justice is the powerful getting to do what they want. That's what justice is. That's his definition of it. And most people think that that would be a great thing. Just get everything my heart desires. Socrates disputes this. The Christian tradition doubles down on what Socrates teaches. In fact, evildoers suffer more than the victims of their evil because their souls are at risk. You've just taken that person's life, but as a consequence, you have lost your eternal life if there's no repentance. And he does not repent because he willfully does it. He is in full knowledge of what the act entails right at the outset. So you have to understand that Macbeth fully understands and thinks like a Christian when he takes this man's life. That is absolutely necessary to understand. So that's the key issue, but there is a progression in the character of Macbeth as well. This is why actors love to play Shakespearean characters, because they are so rich. There's a progression of the character in his fate, and he goes through 3 stages. At first, he's just driven by ambition. He knows what the moral boundary is, he respects it, and he hesitates to take King Duncan's life. That's stage 1. So there's an internal conflict within the character. His wife is saying, do it, do it, do it. You're not a man if you don't do it. The witches prophesied that you would do it, so it's fated. Do it. You have no choice. You have to do it. We'll get to that in a second. How does Shakespeare deal with the issue of fate? That's the first stage, but then he kills the king. So we move to the second stage. Now he feels remorse. But more than remorse, he fears the consequences of his crime. Maybe he's in hell already. He's in a living hell. Right? Because he knows, I ought not to have done it, but I did it. Am I damned? He actually entertains the thought. That doesn't lead him to repent. He could have repented at that point, however, because now he knows the consequences. He had the opportunity not to do it, but once he's done it, realizing the significance of the act, could repent. He does not repent because stronger than that is he wants to gain the benefits of the very crime he committed, which is the monarchy. He is now the king. He wants to solidify that, and so he wants to hush it up. So now he'll commit more crimes. Now the sinful acts magnify. But there's again, he's still a character in conflict. So that's stage 2. The third stage is when he sets all of those behind him. He feels no remorse anymore, and he feels no fear. He fears no man. And at that point, he's a very dangerous individual. No man can stop me. No one of woman born. So says the witch. His soul is almost frozen. Paralyzed. He's almost superhuman because he has no human compassion left in him at all. No fear. Terrifying figure. In our day, the military experiments with drugs that will make soldiers more efficient, remorseless, more able to do what they're on the battlefield to do, to kill without reservation, without guilt, and so forth. Macbeth is such a man because he has willfully murdered his own conscience. So he's not just murdered Duncan, he has murdered his own conscience. It's seared at this point. So he has literally put his humanity to death. Now when I say this, and Shakespeare articulates it, this is not a new thing for Shakespeare's audience. They all understand this really a moral commonplace that evil is its own punishment. You want to do a bad thing? It will make you a bad person, and you will not be happy as a bad person. Even if you get what you desired, you will not be happy. In fact, far worse than that. That's true of all sin, actually. Sin desires its object. At the same time, having achieved it, it suffers for that fact. It's sort of a slave to the idol that it's offered up its actions to. That's with addictions or any category of sin, but this in particular. So Macbeth prepares himself to deny the moral order. So go to stage 1 again. There is a moral order. He knows he ought not to do it, and there's a stage where he prepares himself to deny it, and this is a conscious action, so he doesn't do it by accident. It's not willy-nilly. However, it is instigated by these 3 witches, these 3 fates. So we need to consider, what role do the witches have in instigating Macbeth's actions? Is he guiltless because the witches somehow cast their spell on him and prevented him from acting as a moral agent? These are issues, I think, in the Christian community. These discussions persist to this day. People say, well, there was a demonic possession, or somebody was under supernatural, some sort of supernatural agency, and so they were not able to choose. They were compelled almost because of that to do what they ought not to have done, so it's not their fault. Shakespeare's audience would have been dealing with the exact same issues. This is James, one of James's great, the king, one of his great concerns. Witchcraft will subvert his kingdom. Remember, he is also a Protestant monarch, the man who instigated the writing of the King James Bible, right? Very worried about demonic subversion of his kingdom. Not so worried about Catholic Spain as Elizabeth might have been. The Armadas failed in 1588. There's no longer an external threat. The threat now comes from within. So this raises the moral nature of Macbeth at the outset. Is he actually evil? What is his state? Is he, when we meet him at the outset of the play, a bad man? And if not, what leads him to act as he does? Because it's clearly an evil act, and he acknowledges it as such. But who, other than an evil man, would commit an evil act? A good man can commit an evil act because he has a sinful nature and he's capable of it, right? So just that would be Shakespeare's audience. Shakespeare's audience's answer, and it's also Shakespeare's. On the other hand, and this is interesting as well, Macbeth is a great warrior and is renowned for his violence on the battlefield, and that is in Shakespeare's audience's mind, permissible, because they will distinguish killing in the act of war, presuming that it's a just war, from murder. It's not the same thing. A pacifist cannot read this play and understand it, because it's all species of the same thing. If somebody's died, what's the difference whether it's on the battlefield or if it happens here? It's all sin. That's not what Shakespeare and his audience would understand. The act of killing on the battlefield is still killing. And it's not that it's of no significance. Lives are lost. And so they don't say it's insignificant, but you're not culpable of murder, the charge of murder. But the terms under which the act of war is committed is really important in Shakespeare's mind. It has to be a legitimate situation. So for instance, in the act of war, this will happen in his history plays. What happens if you've captured the enemy's, some of their soldiers, and now you're under siege yourself? What do you do with the prisoners? Because the prisoners can, of course, rise up against you, and now you've got the enemy in front of you and the enemy behind you, what do you do with the prisoners? The temptation is to kill them. That's a war, nowadays would be called a war crime. In Shakespeare's day, it's just an evil act. The temptation is there because the greater evils considered would be considered by the military commander to lose the whole fight. So what do we do there? There's a great deal of controversy in plays in which this, in fact, does happen. I think Henry V. I might be misremembering that, but those sorts of discussions do take place. But Macbeth is renowned for his great violence, and he has killed many in the field of battle. And he is considered to be a good man because of that. Because he is courageous and loyal and wants to protect the good in his warlike acts. So it's not the violence per se which makes him evil. It's the lawless violence. And not only lawless, it's the rebellion against lawful authority, which he acknowledges. That's what makes him evil. It's not the violence per se. So I need to say that because it's not obvious to everyone in our day that that would be so, and that Shakespeare certainly means us to see it as so. So he kills tens of men on the battlefield, and he's considered a hero. He kills one man behind the walls, and he's considered the great criminal. So there's a sense of inequity there. That would have troubled Shakespeare less than it may us. I don't know if anyone is troubled by that here, but I'm just telling you what Shakespeare means us to understand here. The other thing about Macbeth, what makes him a good man, is he's renowned for his loyalty to Duncan. He's renowned for it. So much so that Duncan rewards him. It makes him the Thane of Cawdor. When the Thane of Cawdor dies in battle, Duncan rewards the loyal Macbeth with that title. That title would have obligations that go with it. Oaths would be made. Rings would be exchanged. Think of Lord of the Rings. There would be oaths made. He would swear allegiance to his liege lord, King Duncan, and likewise he would swear that he would love and look after his Thane. So he gives him this, and he does it as a recognition of his great love for his king. So and this is interesting, the Thane of Cawdor, on the other hand, that had just died, was renowned to be a traitor. And every quality, we'll explore this in a second, every quality that was characteristic of the former Thane of Cawdor will also be true of the new Thane of Cawdor. Macbeth, who inherits the title, will also inherit the character. So if you want to see them as foils for one another, it's not really a proper foil, but it is a sort of, there's an analogy certainly being made there. But the play begins with the Thane of Cawdor committing an act of treason and being killed for it. As the play progresses, the new Thane of Cawdor commits an act of treason and he is killed for it. So there's a circular plot structure in that sense. But it's clear in the presence of the witches and in their actions, here we have in Macbeth a man who in battle, look, when you're in battle, however brave you are, there's a danger in it, and you can always be struck down by a random arrow. Like if you think about how they're portrayed even in films now, it's when the battle is going, there's a lot of stuff going on. And somebody can come at you from behind, you can slip, you can get struck. It's very possible to be felled in the field of battle, however brave you are. And he believes in something called fortune. Now, fortune is, or luck, as it's called in the Lord of the Rings, is a sign of divine favor. And some men just seem to be lucky. And it's said of Aragorn, actually, that he's lucky. This is one of the things that most appeals to those around him. How did you escape that? You're a lucky man. But the luck isn't something they're just saying, wow, you're lucky. It's, I'm with you. Because the gods are smiling on you. Right? And that's here also the case with Macbeth. He seems to be a fortunate fellow. Things just happen for him, and this just happens to him. And so he thinks it's God's providence that has blessed him. And when he hears the three witches prophesy and tell him in Act 1, Scene 3, who he is, he starts as if they've read his mind. That's the interesting. Well, I'll come to that in a second. But he believes that, to some degree, that fortune has favored him, and so when the prophecy comes from the witches, he thinks that the moral boundaries which normally bound mortal men with a moral boundary have been overcome by divine blessing. So grace has overcome nature. And then we get into the issue, and this is one of the main concerns in the play. To what degree is Macbeth's fate predetermined or predestined? And if it is predestined that he commit this act because they predict it and it does come to pass, to what extent, if it is predestined, is Macbeth morally guilty? Because my colleagues in philosophy will say if he doesn't have a free choice, then he can't be morally guilty. And if it's fated or predestined that so, then that makes God the moral monster, not Macbeth. Right? Because that's just I don't mean to single that out, but that's the free will position. Is if there is a predestination, there is a sense of divine leading in this, then the person who is involved has no choice in the matter. Actually, that's not fair to characterize the position that way. But there's a sense that it's either you have free will or it's fated and you have none. And here it seems like it was fated and he acts that way. Is he morally guilty for it? Well, it's clear that Shakespeare thinks he is. So if that's the case, is he actually compelled by the witches or not? And how does that work?
Where theologically would Shakespeare have gotten this concept from? Like, would that have been a common teaching in the Protestant church? Would that have been
and Catholic? It's all over the place. So this is the thing. People mistake Calvinist teaching on predestination with Aquinas says the exact same thing on the issue of predestination. It's not a Protestant teaching. It's a standard Christian teaching. The new teaching is that you have a free will that isn't determined by God. Is God sovereign or not? Does God decree what happens on earth? Does he declare what will happen? There's a predestination and so forth. Aquinas speaks to that no differently than Calvin, as far as I can see. At the same time, the objection to that, well, but then they're not guilty for the acts that are committed. That doesn't seem to be the case for a Calvinist or for a Catholic. They think, no, you're still morally guilty because there's an element of you have consented to this and assented to it. How are those two possible? Well, they're not possible if you see them as mutually exclusive. It's an either or. But that they see that it's both and. It's a complementary position. God can predestine it so and see it from the outside, and at the same time the human agents have the capacity for secondary causes. They're able to choose things. To deny the first is to deny that God is God, it seems to me. That's a theological problem. If God does not foresee all things, then he is not omniscient, in which case he's not God. Right? So foresees. On the other hand, if the agents don't have real capacity for action, then how can they possibly be guilty? Right? Because they did the act or they didn't do the act. By throwing the witches into it, it complicates the discussion. Was he compelled to do this? And he explores this through a foil. Now, so we'll come to Act 1, Scene 3 in a minute, but Macbeth is not the only one who hears his fate prophesied. There's another figure who also hears his fate prophesied. Who is that? Banquo. Does Banquo do what he has been told he ought to do or will do? Does he do it? And the answer is no, he does not. Which seems to give us a very good solution. Just because it was prophesied by the witches doesn't mean that they are compelled to do it. And yet, he feels compelled, but not compelled in the sense that he has no choice because he still sees the moral boundary and he chooses to circumvent it. It's not like he becomes unconscious and he just trips over and by accident, oh, what did I do? I killed the king. Oh, I guess I was fated to do that. No, he sees the moral objection and he willfully transgresses it. Hearing the words of the witches in his ears, that he will benefit from it. That just works with his sin. The two cooperate there, whereas Banquo hears what is said and refuses to act upon it. Because he says, this is an evil act, I'm not going to do that. So he has a choice there. So again, Shakespeare's just, and so these two are foils, Macbeth on the one hand and Banquo on the other. Remember that, once again, I said King James regarded himself as a great-great-grandson, great-great-great-great-great whatever, relative of Banquo, the one who chose to do the right thing in the face of the presence of witchcraft and prophecy, which he's alarmed and worried about. Shakespeare's exploring this issue. It's really interesting. Yes?
But Banquo was given a different prophecy.
He is, oh yeah.
But so there wasn't any even clear path of action laid out for Banquo for him to choose or not choose.
No, but his reaction to the prophecy is even different right away. And Banquo, well, I guess we'll look at it more closely in a second, but Banquo, he observes that Macbeth starts when he hears the prophecy. And he's also leery of Macbeth right away as well. He seems to sense that there's something, you heard this just like I did, but your reaction is different than mine. Why is that? There's an almost, and this would really come out, and the actors would bring this out. Like, how did they respond to this? It's tough to act this part. Like, how do you act like an ambitious man who knows that there's a moral trend? Like, how do you express that in your gestures and in your voice and so forth? And the other character, how does he, like, you really have to have a keen capacity to act that. But that interaction between the characters makes it clear that there is a difference in how they receive it. And you're right, there isn't a clear course of action, but he doesn't even receive it as, oh good, can't wait for this to happen, and he doesn't try and bring it about either. But you're right, the prize seems, it's not right under his nose in the same way. That's true, 100% true. But I think they're meant to be foils for one another. But why don't we actually look at the beginning of the play? But those are the issues that seem to arise here, is what role the fates have in this, and whether they actually determine the action or not. Now, in Holinshed's Chronicles, I will add, the three witches are also the three goddesses of destiny. And the word weird here in Anglo-Saxon means fate, the three fates. The three sisters are fates of sorts. Now, remember if you, or maybe remember if you, in case you didn't know, in the ancient world, the fates determined all, and the gods were under the fates. They had no capacity to change what was fated. They could delay it, but they could not change it. The fates were all determining. It was a fatalistic universe. Achilles was fated to die at a young age. On the other hand, he seems to, Homer puts this in, he could have chosen to live to a ripe old age, or to die young. He chooses to die young, but he was also fated there. So again, even Homer is exploring this issue of the choice, because if he doesn't choose to die young, he's not quite so heroic. On the other hand, he's fated to do this, and that means that there's an awareness of a destiny which will make him great as well. And so he's exploring it in the same way. But that sense of fates and the gods being under the direction of the fates, and that there's no changing those fates, that's a pagan view. That's not Shakespeare's view. That would be the view of the Norse as well as the Greeks. It's pagan. For Shakespeare, God will predestine. In other words, decree, determine the outcome. But God himself can be prayed to. And we even get instances in Scripture, although God's will is sovereign and perfect and good, that God repents of a resolution. Delays, changes, seems to be responsive to prayer. I don't want to get into the whole theological aspect, but you can see the difference there. God is a person, not just the fates are. You can't appeal to the fates. There's no changing the fates. Not even the gods can change the fates by any means. There's no one. What's fated is fated. There's no instance of the fates being appeased, their decree being changed. There's no way. Nobody even tries to appeal to the fates. It's fated. Zeus looks up and sees the fates have decreed it, and I have to do it. It's my job as the father of gods and men to do what the fates have decreed. That's it. What am I going to do? And the other gods are rebelling and say, but we don't like that. We don't like that outcome. And they delay it temporarily. But it's fated that Odysseus is going to get back home. So let him get back home. Why don't you? Well, because Poseidon won't let him get back home. Well, you need to slap him into line. It's fated that he be so. I mean, did he not burn oxen to you all day long? Was he not a good man? Did he ever stop worshipping the gods as he ought to? What's wrong with you, Zeus? Come on, get in line and bring him home, says Athena. And so while Poseidon's away with the Ethiopians, Athena comes in and says, okay, now let's do it while he's away. And Zeus, oh, okay. Poseidon comes back, how dare you while I'm away? Right? Well, I had no choice. It was fated. Okay, but then they have to do something to appease Poseidon. But now again, it's almost comic. Quarreling of the children, but the children can't change the decree because there is no way of changing what's fated. It's necessary. There's no freedom in that sense. Whereas here there is. You can always appeal to God, pray to God, and God, because his character is of love and mercy for his creatures, will be attentive to those who truly repent. It's a very different universe. But to say that God predestines is just to say that God knows the outcome and chooses the outcomes. The things happen as God wills. Doesn't mean that God has no freedom or that we have none. We have the capacity for secondary causes. Can instigate actions and are accountable for them. Anyway, but as I say, in Holinshed's chronicles, the three witches are the goddesses of destiny, and they are prophetic figures, and they are unbiased. They're a lot like this, in other words. They have no bias. It's just, this is what's going to happen. Whereas here, the three are portrayed not as fates, they are portrayed as witches, which is a decidedly different thing. They are now evil agents. They are transgressions of nature. These are women with beards. Right? They're presented as somehow being both male and female. They're hermaphrodites. They don't actually have corporeal bodies, furthermore. and they practice the black arts, they're in league with Satan. That's how they're portrayed in Shakespeare. So this is a Christianizing of Holinshed's chronicles. In Holinshed, they're presented as more along the lines of a pagan understanding, whereas here they fit a Christian understanding. These figures are not fates in the sense of all determining, they are witches in the sense that they are malign spiritual figures. There's a significant difference. So that's Shakespeare's departure from Holinshed. And Macbeth in many ways is like Christopher Marlowe's figure of Dr. Faustus. And some think that Marlowe's Faustus was influenced by Macbeth. And in his portrait of the three witches here, remember, have you read Marlowe's Dr. Faustus? There's a temptation, the devil comes and offers him. If you do this, I will give you these things. But it's a diabolical temptation. I will give you what your heart desires here. It's not just seen as fate, it's diabolical. It's a devil involved there. So Shakespeare wants to use the witches to tempt Macbeth and tempt his soul. Then it is a Christian play. Shakespeare makes it so. And the temptation is to get him to overlook what he sees as clear moral boundaries. Let's make those a little blurry. So in other words, the satanic assault on Macbeth is that of a loss of discrimination. What he can see clearly now seems shrouded in darkness, just like the play is shrouded in darkness, so he can no longer see clearly what moral goodness and moral badness are. And he will no longer be able to recognize friend from foe. In fact, his friend will be his foe. So there's lots of what Shakespeare calls equivocation. Equating two things and presenting them in ambiguous terms. A loss of moral clarity on Macbeth's part. Which is not only Shakespeare's Christian view, maybe it's because I share Shakespeare's Christian view, I think it's psychologically also true. When you commit an evil act, one of the worst consequences is you lose a sense that it was an evil act, and then so you commit more evil acts. Right? So one of the worst consequences of sin is it begets more sin, and maybe still worse is a loss of a sense that it is sin anymore. And then you start repeating, well, I was compelled to do it. I couldn't stop myself. I had to do it. That sort of language, right? And even there's psychologically, somebody who's addicted to anything will tell you that they feel compelled and they can't stop. But a doctor will tell you biochemically that addictions, the actual physical presence of a drug or alcohol, it's out of your system within days or a week or so. It's gone. There is no more chemical stimulus, and yet the addiction is more than that. So I very briefly in younger years when I was in Germany smoked. And I didn't do it when I was young because I was an asthmatic, and what a stupid thing to do. But when I lived in Germany, everybody smoked in the university, and it drove me insane. It drove me insane because I was inhaling smoke, and I couldn't stop it. I was like, what am I? So I found that by smoking myself, it didn't bother me as much that I was suffering from other people smoking. Of course, I was inhaling it more in my lungs. So the effect was worse, but I wasn't as angry at everyone. Right? So it was this really bizarre thing. Okay, so then, but now I'm coughing up a lung. And so I decided I'm going to quit the cigarettes. Well, it was hard for a couple of days. And there's you're literally coughing up a lung. Not literally, because the lung's not coming up, but there's a lot of coughing to get that out. But that's out within a couple of days. I was living with a doctor, a trainee doctor at the time. But I can tell you, I dreamed about smoking for years after. And long after that I had just for a brief time smoked cigarettes, I thought, you know what? A cigarette would go well with this beer. And I go, get that thought out of your head. And then okay, I'll have one. I'll have two. Oh yeah, sure, why not? I'll have one. Okay, and there I am again. I'm back there and I'm dreaming about a cigarette. Good grief. So that can't be explained physically. That's a psychological thing. Is it more than that? I think so. I'm just giving you my own personal and a limited experience with that. I actually think this is how these things work. And Shakespeare demonstrates that. And what you feel is a sense of compulsion. And why is the compulsion there? Because you've assented to it to begin with. Well, maybe you ought not in that case. I don't know. But it's harder once you've given into it to then resist it. That's for sure. And so if you're an alcoholic, you have to continue to keep going to AA because you're really liable to go back into that. Like really liable. In fact, you're inclined in that direction. And that doesn't go away. So you have to stick with the program. And that's just illustrating what Shakespeare, I think, here is illustrating about the nature of evil. There is a sense in which once you've committed it, you feel compulsion and you point to the fact that you had no choice. Whereas it's clear at the outset he is aware of a clear choice that he has to make. But once he's made it, there's a sense that he loses the capacity to do other than to continue to pursue evil. Now, I think he still can, but he would then have to pray and God would have to release him from, if it were a true repentance, could release him from the bondage of sin. But he doesn't do that. And he doesn't want to do that. He wants what his ambition led him to do at the outset. So to me, it's psychologically plausible as well as spiritually plausible. And I just gave you my experience just to tell you why I find it so persuasive. And it's very interesting. So the ambiguities and the equivocation is right there at the outset in the witch's speech. Fair is foul and foul is fair, say the witches. Category confusion. Good is evil and evil is good. Evil be thou my good, says Satan. Macbeth is going to say something of the same. For him, what was formerly foul will now be fair. But that's what the witches will do. They will lead into moral confusion as much as anything else. And it's also interesting that they appear to him at the very moment after he has been victorious in battle. They were not summoned. He doesn't call upon them. He has been victorious. And again, this seems to me psychologically plausible. Because some of the greatest temptations happen at the moment when you've achieved a great victory in life. Because at that moment, there's an inevitable sense of letdown. I don't have many great victories in my life. One of them was handing over my PhD after 5 years. I handed it over. It was one of the lowest moments of my whole life. It's like, that's it. Like, you know, there's no applause, there's nothing. Now, okay, I've spent 5 years on this. All right, I hand it over. Now what do I do? Like, okay, that was a significant body of time and energy directed to one end, and now I've handed it over, and okay, now what do I do? And terrific letdown, very low. Moment of success, though, it's all, yeah, but that is often the case. People that achieve success will have that sense. So they come to him at a point when he's actually psychologically vulnerable, I think, and at any rate. So anyway, let's look at Act 1, Scene 1 here. First witch. When shall we three meet again? In thunder, lightning, or in rain? When the hurly-burly's done? When the battle's lost and won? That will be ere the set of sun. Where the place? Upon the heath, there to meet with Macbeth. I come, grey Malkin. Paddock calls. Anon. All is fair. Fair is foul and foul is fair. Hover through the fog and filthy air. That's the interest. And they come in thunder and lightning. These three weird sisters. the three witches. They're called three weird sisters later on. Then we get the scene, enter an alarum within, a big noise, and enter King Duncan, Malcolm, Donalbain, Lennox, the attendants, and there's a bleeding sergeant. Duncan, what bloody man is that? He can report, as seemeth by his plight, of the revolt, the newest state. This is the sergeant, said Malcolm, who, like a good and hardy soldier, fought 'gainst my captivity. Hail, brave friend! Say to the king the knowledge of the broil as thou didst leave it. And the sergeant then reports, doubtful it stood, as two spent swimmers that do cling together and choke their art. The merciless MacDonald, worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him, from the western isles of kerns and gallow glasses is supplied. And fortune on his damned quarrel smiling showed like a rebel's whore. But all's too weak, for brave Macbeth, well he deserves that name, disdaining fortune, with his brandished steel, which smoked with bloody execution, like valor's minion, carved out his passage till he faced the slave, which never shook hands, nor bade farewell to him, and till he unseamed him from the nave of the chops, and fixed his head upon our battlements. So, yeah, the nave of the gutted him. And Duncan's response, "O valiant cousin, worthy gentleman, as whence the sun gins his reflection, shipwracking storms and direful thunders break, so from the spring whence comfort seemed to come, discomfort swells. Mark, King of Scotland, mark, no sooner justice had, with valor armed, compelled these skipping kerns to trust their heels, but the Norwegian lord, surveying vantage with furbished arms and new supplies of men, began a fresh assault. Dismayed not this our captains Macbeth and Banquo? Yes, as sparrows eagles, or the hare the lion. If I say sooth, I must report they were as cannons overcharged with double cracks, so they doubly redoubled strokes upon the foe, except they meant to bathe in reeking wounds or memorize another Golgotha, I cannot tell. But I am faint, my gashes cry for help. And then Duncan, so well thy words become thee as thy wounds. They smack of honor both. Go get him surgeons. Okay. And now Ross and Angus come in. I'll just talk about them because they are not insignificant later on. Who comes here? Malcolm. The worthy Thane of Ross. What a haste looks through his eyes, should he look that seems to speak things strange. God save the king. Whence camest thou, worthy Thane? From Fife, great king, where the Norwegian banners flout the sky and fan our people cold. Norway himself, with terrible numbers, assisted by that most disloyal traitor, the Thane of Cawdor, began a dismal conflict, till that Bellana's bridegroom, lapped in proof, confronted him with self-comparisons, point against point, rebellious arm against arm, curbing his lavish spirit, and to conclude, the victory fell on us. Great happiness! That now Sweno, the Norway's king, craves composition, nor would we deign him burial of his men till he dispersed at St. Colme's inch the $10,000 to our general use. No more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest. Go pronounce his present death, and with his former title greet Macbeth. I'll see it done. What he hath lost, noble Macbeth hath won. Okay, so note that the scenes are really short and the speeches equally brief. There's a lot of excitement transmitted through short speeches, so the characters are agitated emotionally while the scenes demonstrate why. Right? This is an instant of battle, a victory's been won. there's been, as I say, treachery, rebellion in the ranks. And so all of this happens extraordinarily quickly. Now, with that in mind, scene 3, the witches come in again with thunder. Where hast thou been, sister? Killing swine. Sister, where thou? A sailor's wife had chestnuts in her lap, and mounched and mounched and mounched. Give me, quoth I. Aright the witch, the rump-fed Ronion cries, her husband's to Aleppo gone. Master the tiger, but in a sieve I'll thither sail, and like a rat without a tail, I'll do, and I'll do. I'll give thee a wind, art kind, and I another. I myself have all the other, and the very ports they blow, all the quarters that they know. In the shipman's card I'll drain him dry as hay. Sleep shall neither night nor day hang upon his penthouse lid. He shall live a man forbid. Weary 7 nights, 9 times 9 shall he dwindle, peak, and pine. Though his bark cannot be lost, yet it shall be tempest-tossed. Look what I have! Show me, show me! Here I have a pilot's thumb, racked as homeward he did come. A drum, Macbeth doth come. And now all 3. The weird sisters, hand in hand, posters of the sea and land, thus do go, about, thrice to thine, and thrice to mine, and thrice again to make up 9. Peace, the charms wound up. Now Macbeth and Banquo. So there's an invocation that they call themselves the 3 weird sisters. They say the word weird here, suggesting fate. But they're witches. Enter Macbeth and Banquo. And now, remember the speech from the fair is foul and foul is fair? Macbeth. So foul and fair a day I have not seen. Echoing the language. How far is it called to for us? What are these, so withered and so wild in their attire, that look not like the inhabitants of the earth, and yet are on it? Live you, or are you aught that man may question? You seem to understand me, by each at once her choppy finger laying upon her skinny lips. You should be women, and yet your beards forbid me to interpret that you are so. Macbeth, speak, if you can. What are you? All hail, Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Glamis! All hail, Macbeth! Hail to thee, Thane of Cawdor! All hail, Macbeth! That shalt be king hereafter. Banquo. Good sir, why do you start, and seem to fear things that do sound so fair? In the name of truth, are ye fantastical, or that indeed which outwardly you show? My noble partner you greet with present grace, and great prediction of noble having and of royal hope, that he seems rapt withal. To me you speak not. If you can look into the seeds of time and say which grain will grow and which will not, speak then to me, who neither beg nor fear your favours nor your hate. Hail, hail, hail! Lesser than Macbeth, and greater, not so happy, yet much happier. Thou shalt get kings, though thou be none. So all hail, Macbeth and Banquo. Banquo and Macbeth, all hail. Stay, says Macbeth, you imperfect speakers, tell me more. By Sinel's death I know I am Thane of Glamis, but how of Cawdor? The Thane of Cawdor lives, a prosperous gentleman, and to be king stands not within the prospect of belief, no more than to be Cawdor. Say, from whence you owe this strange intelligence, or why upon this blasted heath you stop our way with such prophetic greeting? Speak, I charge you. And then they disappear. Banquet, the earth hath bubbles as the water has. and these are of them. Whither are they vanished? Into the air, and what seemed corporal melted as breath into the wind. Would they had stayed. Banquo, were such things here as we do speak about? Or have we eaten on the insane root that takes the reason prisoner? Your children shall be kings. You shall be king. Sort of making fun of the prophecy, right? And Thane of Cawdor soon went it not so, and to the self-same tune and words. Who's here? Enter Ross and Angus. Ross, the king hath happily received, Macbeth, the news of thy success, and when he reads thy personal venture in the rebels' fight, his wonders and his praises to do contend, which should be thine or his. Silenced with that, in viewing o'er the rest of the self-same day, he finds thee in the stout Norwegian ranks, nothing afeard of what thyself didst make. Strange images of death, as thick as tale, came post with post, and every one did bear thy praises in his kingdom's great defence, and poured them down before him. And then Angus, we are sent to give thee from our royal master thanks, only to herald thee into his sight, not pay thee. And for an earnest of a greater honour, he bade me from him call thee Thane of Cawdor. In which addition, hail, most worthy Thane, for it is thine. Banquo, what? Can the devil speak true? Macbeth, the Thane of Cawdor lives. Why do you dress me in borrowed robes? Angus, who was the Thane? Lives yet, but under heavy judgment bears that life which he deserves to lose. Whether he was combined with those of Norway, or did line the rebel with hidden help and vantage, or that with both he laboured in his country's wrack, I know not. But treason's capital, confessed and proved, have overthrown him. And then Macbeth, aside in his thoughts then. This is what he's thinking. And the audience is privy to it, but the other figures are not. Glamis and Thane of Cawdor, the greatest is behind to Ross and Angus, so he's now thinking about the kingship. Thanks for your pains, and then aside to Banquo, do you not hope your children shall be kings, when those that gave the Thane of Cawdor to me promised no less to them? And then Banquo, again just the two of them, that trusted home might yet enkindle you unto the crown, besides the Thane of Cawdor. But 'tis strange, and oftentimes to win us to our harm, the instruments of darkness tell us truths, win us with honest trifles, to betray us in deepest consequence. Cousins, a word I pray you. Now this is Banquo's interpretation of fortune. The devil can work in trifling things to bring us to great ruin. Spiritual insight. Don't just think because fortunes happen that that good entails, even though prosperity ensues from it. This good preaching for the prosperity gospel crowd. Because you've benefited from it, that doesn't mean this is not for your harm. Now Macbeth, again aside. So just Macbeth and the audience aware of this, what he says here. Two truths are told, as happy prologues to the swelling act of the imperial theme. And now to them, I thank you gentlemen. And then aside again. This supernatural soliciting cannot be ill, cannot be good. If ill, why hath it given me earnest of success, commencing in a truth? I am Thane of Cawdor. If good, why do I yield to that suggestion and make my seated heart knock my ribs against the use of nature? In other words, why do I want to kill Macbeth or Duncan? If it's good, then why am I tempted to do an evil deed? Why is my heart knocking against my rib to do what's against nature? The use of nature. Present fears are less than horrible imaginings. My thought, whose murther yet is but fantastical, shakes so my single state of man, that function is smothered in surmise, and nothing is but what is not. And then Banquo, looking at him, look how our partner's rapt. Now the word rapt here means that he is captured, captivated. He seems possessed. That's the comment. And he's made it twice. He's rapt at what he hears. It's got a hold of him. He's stunned and empowered by it, or he's lost his capacity to think. And then Macbeth, once again aside, if chance will have me king, why chance may crown me without my stir. So he's thinking, how am I going to become king? Well, this was by chance. I knew it not. This may happen. New honors come upon him like our strange garments. Cleave not to their mold, but with the aid of use. Macbeth aside again. So there's a lot of thinking going on in Macbeth. Come what come may. Time and the hour runs through the roughest day. And then Banquo, worthy Macbeth, we stay upon your leisure. Give me your favour, my dull brain was wrought with things forgotten. Kind gentlemen, your pains are registered, where every day I turn the leaf to read them. Let us toward the king. And then to Banquo. Think upon what hath chanced, and at more time the interim having weighed it, let us speak our free hearts each to other. Banquo very gladly. Till then, enough. Come, friends. Okay. So we see that they come, the witches appear to Macbeth right at the moment of his victory. He doesn't call them to come. He will call upon them, but he doesn't do that here. And they appear to break down his reasoning power, his moral reasoning power. That's the point here. It's not his capacity for thinking clearly, logically. His moral reasoning has been disrupted. He's actually contemplating the murder right away. Confesses that. Macbeth's reaction, as I say, is different from that of Banquo to the prophecies. Macbeth, we're told, is rapt, captured. Rapt is from the Latin for to capture. He's captivated at the news of his fate. And why? Because secretly in his heart of hearts, he probably has already had that thought. And did they know what I was thinking? But note at this point, and Banquo seems more, okay, that happened. Well, that's interesting. You will be the father of kings, and you will be king. And there's sort of a little jovial thing, but they're both playing a bit. Because Banquo is looking at Macbeth, I noticed how you responded there. There was a little less than jocularity. And for his part, Macbeth is concealing from Banquo where his heart lies, but both of them are aware of one another as moral agents. And they're a threat to one another in that sense. But note that Macbeth does not overstep his moral boundaries, and he uses his his moral reasoning to overcome the temptation of the witches' prophecies. And he says, it may come about that chance will have me king. Line 142 there. If chance will have me king, why chance may crown me without my stir. I don't need to do anything. But why does he come to that thought? Because he was weighing up taking the immoral action. But you know what? It would be better if I didn't do that. But he's considering it as a possibility at this stage. But he doesn't want to do it because he realizes it's the wrong thing to do. So is the murder of Duncan preordained, or does it originate in Macbeth's mind? There's a dramatic tension here in the character, and it seems like the composite effect and the concentrated effect of the actions by the witches and Macbeth's own anticipation of the deed. There's a combination of there. by the way, the prophecies are one of the reasons the play is so short is the prophecies seem to be fulfilled precipitously. The characters are really eager to have them happen, so that the play is abbreviated because of the characters' eagerness to do the evil deeds. The fall happens quite rapidly. So the evil act, there's not much delay here. We're not waiting around, and so he could have portrayed it differently. He could have waited and had Macbeth weighing back and forth for 3 acts, and then in Act 3 commits the evil deed. That would be characteristic of what we've seen. This terrible event in Act 3, but he doesn't. He commits it right here in Act 1. So the suspense is gone at that point, and other things ensue then. But Macbeth becomes a victim of his own will. And this is interesting because come the modern period and the Enlightenment period, I would add further, there is believe it or not, even though the Enlightenment calls itself the age of reason, the Enlightenment distrusts the power of reason. The Middle Ages and the Renaissance and the ancient world all believe that reason has a power to overcome the will. It not only can, and it ought to, and they believe that reason can inform the will. But in the modern period, as in contemporary post-Enlightenment, there's a sense that the will is stronger than reasoning. And Macbeth himself expresses that will and is almost a victim of his own will. And the more he acts, the more he loses the freedom to act. And the further he follows that action, which loses him the freedom to act, the more he descends into a hell on earth. The hell lies within him. He becomes a satanic figure of sorts. But I will conclude with that, and we'll pick it up next time.